safe space. We ain't never give a reason you should hide. Compile all your questions, we're taking the quest. Join Tarsha on this journey to discover the rest. Go.
Welcome to the Adoption Journey podcast. I am your host, Tarsha Smith, and thank you so much for joining us today on yet another journey. Before we get started, I want to remind you, don't forget to go and become a supporter over on Patreon. We got a lot of great stuff going on over there. But we're going to dive in today. I'm very excited to have Tara with us today. She is a fellow adoptee. Correct?
I am. Hello. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. And we're going to go ahead and dive right in. So my first question always, how old were you when you found out that you were adopted?
Yeah, so my stories, I was 11, so I lived with my biological family until the age of 11.
Oh, okay.
Mhm.
So you were with your biological family.
I was.
Foster care and then adoption, or?
No, I was, so never entered foster care, thank goodness. I
Okay.
felt lucky to not have to experience all that.
Yeah.
But no, I lived with my first family, my biological father and mother, until the age of 11. And then I ended up, I know we'll kind of get into it, but lived with my maternal uncle and his wife, my aunt, who I call mom and dad, that eventually adopted me at the age of
Okay.
13.
And so I have to ask, and if you can tell, and if not, just pull me back.
Yeah.
What happened with your biological parents?
Yeah. A lot. Well, and I'm laughing because it's my natural way of sort of getting through the daunting feeling that's overwhelming me right now of talking about it. Like, where do I start?
Yeah.
Yeah, my biological mother, um, had a mental health condition, and you may stop me and ask me a question. But later on in life, right, she's still living now, and I have communication with her.
Mm-hmm.
I discovered, and I'm still trying to figure out if it's accurate or not, but that she also had a developmental delay. And so that kind of didn't create such a great environment. My father worked odd hours and a lot, worked the graveyard shift a lot, so it left me with my mother and my biological sister, um, which kind of put us in very confusing situations at times. So it wasn't a very safe environment.
Okay. And is
Yeah.
it one of those things where the state had to step in and say we have to remove these
No, thank goodness,
children?
no. I had family to sort of, my uncle. I
Yeah.
remember people sitting, I remember my biological parents sitting with my adoptive parents, and it's kind of a blur, but I do remember them speaking about, the importance of me being safe. And so, that led to me moving in with at that time, my uncle and his wife,
Okay.
while my sister stayed behind.
That's what I was going to ask about.
Yeah,
Was it you
yeah.
and your sister, or?
No, my sister so I was more the quiet one,
Mm-hmm.
and that's sort of like just, I didn't cause any trouble because I kind of saw what was going on around me. I chose to go the polar opposite. My sister was involved, with people that weren't so great for her at a very young age, just given what
Okay.
she, was kind of taught and allowed to do. She didn't have any guidance. We didn't have guidance. And so I think at that time she was in a juvenile detention center,
Okay. And
and
she's younger.
she's older.
She's
She's 2 years
older.
older. Mm-hmm.
Okay. You're the baby.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And
So
that,
they were
yeah.
like, okay, well, we're going to take this one because this one is already spinning, it would seem like.
Yeah, and it's not something I really thought about for a
Yeah.
long time,
Mm-hmm.
but I think as I got older and I don't know, just, my brain developed more, I was able to kind of like process it more,
Process.
but
Yeah.
I didn't really think about it like that then. But yeah, I
That's
mean,
interesting.
100%.
Because she
Hmm.
was still a kid, but it's interesting that they chose to. Oh, of course, we don't know what the whole conversation was, but it's interesting that it ended up, I'll say that, just being you
Yeah.
and they got to go live. So when you went to go live with your uncle, did life get better? Uh oh.
Like immediately? You mean like once I
Just
started living with
when
them or
you
kind of over
started
time?
living there over time, was it weird at first?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Did you know him like that to be going to live in his house?
I knew him as Uncle Billy. I knew him as the uncle who came into town and would come take the kiddos and buy them presents and he was the fun uncle.
Okay.
Um,
And who
s-
was that, your mom's sibling or dad's
my
sibling?
my mother's brother.
Okay.
Yeah.
But just still essentially a stranger to have to go and live with. It's one thing to
Hmm.
come in and spend a little bit of time with you and you give me gifts. Something totally different if I have to now do life with you.
Completely. Yeah.
How
It,
do you
I
feel at 11?
I was 11. I was 11 when I started living with them. It's kind of a complex situation. So, to kind of like in a nutshell, I lived with them at 11 due to what I was experiencing. Um, you know, I'm comfortable sharing that now. It's part of my story, but I, thankfully never experienced things like rape. But, there were other scenarios that could have led to that. And
Mm.
so it wasn't a safe environment. And so at 11, I went with them, and then I ended up, and it was kind of a blur for a minute there as I
For sure.
processed through it in therapy, which I think is so important.
Yes.
But I then went back with the understanding that I was going to go back.
And when you say
And
back, you mean back with mom and dad?
yeah, so when I left my aunt and uncle and went back with my biological parents,
Okay.
I had this understanding for whatever reason that I was going to go back to my aunt and uncle and
Okay.
finish out the school year.
Okay. Oh,
Um,
wait, I do. Let me ask you this. How far away did you move? Like, are you out of state, out of just a different city?
yeah, so I was living in Texas and then I moved to Florida. Hmm.
Mm,
Hmm.
okay, that that changes the game.
Yeah,
You are, yeah,
yeah, yeah.
totally out of your
Fish
element
out of water.
for
Yeah.
sure.
I felt safe. So to answer your question, I felt safe going into their home, but it was a little, I don't know, it was a little weird for me because of backing up a little bit of having to go back with my biological family with
Hmm.
this understanding that I was going to go back and finish out the year. And maybe something inside of me felt like I really just wanted to stay with them. And I hadn't told them yet what happened to me. Um, and I ended up telling them. And
Could
I,
you elaborate? Are you comfortable with sharing what happened to
yeah,
you?
yeah. It was years of different experiences that I kind of mentioned a minute ago, but
Hmm.
I think the straw, whatever that saying is, the straw that
The
broke the
show that
camel's
broke the
back,
camel's back. Yeah.
was my sister's, and if she watches this one day, I love you. But my sister's significant other at that time was much older than me, and you know, there was molestation. Um, And so you can imagine going back into that environment. I just remember like pulling and reaching from any which way of any family member who would allow me to stay with them. And basically what happened is I ended up moving in with my grandmother.
Okay, I have a question.
Sure.
Because now that you've mentioned grandmother, in my brain, typically, when there's something going on, usually grandparents are kind of the first people to step in and be like, hey, so were your grandparents in the picture? I'm just trying to understand how you ended up with an uncle.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. My grandmother had her own set of, I love her. She's no longer here, but I love her, but she had her own set of like, she drank, you know.
Okay, so
She was sort of in that,
got you.
I don't know.
I get it. I get it.
And then I think on top of that, raising a child, she had 4 kids, 3 girls, 1 boy. And my mother, my biological mother, was the oldest. And I think spending so many years taking care of her, and it makes so much sense to me now. It was almost as if I put a puzzle piece in, and I went, oh my God. When I found out from my biological mother is under hospice care right now.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear
And
that.
it's okay. She's comfortable. Thank you. But it took the hospice nurse to tell me, just in some intake that they had to do, you know, oh, and is this right that your mom had or has cerebral palsy? And I went,
oh, what a
I
way to
didn't know
find
that.
out.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
And if, you know, I did a little bit of looking up on it at that time, and I knew a little bit about it, but there's a developmental piece to it. And so it was just kind of like putting a piece of the puzzle in my story and going, it wasn't just mom's mental health, it was also developmentally this lack of ability to really fully be able to be present as a parent without help. So my grandmother, yeah. So I think, to answer your question, my grandmother probably was just checked out.
Yeah, I understand. I understand. So you go back to Texas and then you end up living with your grandmother. Even is she still checked out by the time you get there? Every time I ask this question, you smile. You're like,
well, you know, and she was sort of like the matriarch. Like everyone goes to grandma's house, you know, holidays, birthdays. Grandma took care of everyone. I don't think she was checked out. And I think certain parts I'll just choose not to share because I think, you know.
That's fine.
But to read
your story.
Yeah.
It's fine. Yeah.
I think to read between the lines with that, she loved me. She took me in. She had a spouse at the time who I am grateful for bringing me in, but she still had an alcohol problem, you know. So she wasn't really present. She was at the local bar. So I love you, but yeah.
I hear you. Yeah. So by the time you get to grandma's house, how old are you now?
I was still 11. I think it was like between 11 and 12.
Oh my gosh, you had so much happen at 11. That's a lot. That's a lot of bouncing around in a year's time. I was under the impression we had moved forward just a little bit in your age, but So how long do you stay with? Is this where you remain, or do you bounce around once again?
No, I didn't remain there. I remember at some point her basically saying, we need to get you back with your parents. And I remember moving in. At that point, my parents were going through a divorce. Okay. So my mom was living on her own, dad was living on his own with my sister primarily, who also had the boyfriend still at that time kind of around. And I was, at that point, I went and I moved back in with my father. So back into the situation.
Mm.
Um,
And do you stay there through, how long do you end up, like when you move back in and then these things are happening? I want to tap into what was going on with you because you still got to go to school.
mm.
You still got to, try and function outside the home. Do you remember what that was like for you?
Yeah, I think when you're in a situation like that, you are in survival mode.
Mm.
And I very much was in survival mode. I can't thank my best friend enough. That's still my best friend till this day. Um, I can't thank her enough for introducing herself to me in PE class in middle
Mm.
school because, and I've talked with her mom as an adult now. I've talked with her mom about sort of that time frame in my life. And I remember having the conversation with her mom and I asked her, I said, did you know what was going on? How aware were you? And she said to me, and I'll never forget this, she told me about this conversation happened about 6 months ago.
Mm.
Um, she said, Tara, I had a conversation with another kid's mom, which was another friend of ours. And she said to that mom, what do we do? Do we call DCF?
Mm.
What do we do? And the other mom looked at her, and then my friend's mother looked back at the other mom and she said, I mean, I guess she has us. She has us, so we don't need to do that. And I just spent a really like every day at my best friend's house.
They were looking out for you and you didn't even know it.
It gives me goosebumps every time I think about it till this day
Yeah.
because I just can't thank them enough for being a pivotal piece in my life because
You know
should they
what's
not have been there? Yeah.
important about that is there are kids going through stuff and, you know, somebody might watch this right now and they don't even realize that somebody is watching, somebody is paying attention, someone has really got your back. In the way they're navigating it, you're oblivious to it right now. And that's what was happening with you. And that's a blessing.
Absolutely.
And it definitely happens because people do pay attention.
Mm-hmm. And
And
when
there's
you're a
a,
kid, you don't realize.
right. And there's a way, um, and I guess in your case, they said, should we call DCF? But I don't know. Maybe there are times when if the village would just step in, maybe you don't
100%.
have to get, because when you call DCF, then that's a whole. And sometimes, let me just say this, sometimes it is necessary that DCF is called for
Yeah.
sure.
I think the system is absolutely broken, right?
Yeah.
We could go on for hours, I'm sure, about
Hours.
that. But I feel like I would have gotten lost in the system. Like I just if that call would have been made, I wouldn't be where I am today for sure.
Hmm.
Um, but I felt like I would have gotten lost in the system. So yeah, I think that ability to just have that not kinship, but village, that
Yeah. The, the
those
village.
adults that
Yeah.
cared.
The village. So, so do you end up by the time like you go through middle school, you go through high school, is there still a lot of bouncing around? At what point do you land and you're like,
Hmm.
okay, I'm
Hmm.
stable, I'm here?
And I have to get clarity on this, but I'm pretty sure my best friend's mom had something to do with it. Um, but I think she had a conversation with my grandmother, like a
Mm.
really honest conversation of, listen, I know what's going on. Um, And at that point, I remember going and living back with my uncle and my aunt, um, my adoptive parents. I call them mom and dad. So, but just to kind of not create any confusion. Um, and so it was seventh grade. I was like right there at that 11 to 12-year-old marker.
Okay.
Um, but I wasn't adopted until 13. So I did finally end up back at their house, and I had a conversation which was extremely scary for me at the time. I said, I have to tell him. I was screaming out for help, basically, of like, I just want safety.
Yeah, you want to feel safe for sure.
Yeah. And I told him, and
And what
they
happened?
they they said, absolutely, you're not going back. We're sorry.
I'm so glad to hear that was the response because unfortunately, sometimes when kids tell, they're not believed.
hmm hmm I wasn't believed by my grandmother, when I had disclosed previous stuff to her. But again, I think she came from that mentality of like old school, hush hush, you don't talk about
Oh,
it,
for
you
sure.
know.
For
So
sure.
I have experienced, this being vulnerable and saying something, and at least to family. But yes, I feel very lucky that, speaking to it with my adopted parents, that it was something that they were receptive to and received.
So
Yeah.
by the time you land and then you're back with your aunt and your uncle, are you like when you go through high school and everything, because the way that you were adopted is like I'm just going to say non-traditional
Right.
in the sense, quote unquote. So how does one feel when they've been adopted in this manner? Like, do you feel like you can't go to your parents? Do you feel, I don't know what's the word I'm looking for, unattached from your parents? Are you deciding to make I don't know, to not have a relationship and, I'm going to force this relationship over here with who you now call mom and dad? Like, what does that look
hmm
like?
I think in the moment, and I can speak about it from like an adult's, from now, me as an adult, but in the moment, um, it was super confusing.
Mm,
I I look back on photos of my adoption day, of the day I was adopted. I just remember like I was the youngest child, and then I was adopted into being the oldest child.
mm,
My
hmm.
cousins, who I call my brother and sisters, um, you know, they had just had my brother who was like 3 at that point, and
Mm-hmm.
then they had my middle sister. So I went from youngest to oldest, so that was weird in and of
That's weird.
itself.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I just remember being there in front of the judge that day and kind of like sitting at the tables and the attorney and my family and family behind me. And like I looked and I went, this feels supportive, but
But
I don't, this doesn't feel, it feels weird.
it didn't feel natural.
It didn't feel natural at all. And I just kept thinking, this is okay, you're safe. That went through my mind. This is okay, you're safe. You're safe.
Mm.
And
I want to know if there was just something inside of you, regardless of whatever the situation was at home, that you still just wanted to be with your your biological mom and or dad.
hmm yeah, yes. So I remember after I was adopted, I obviously had conversations with my biological mom through telephone, and then if we would go for family events, Christmas, Thanksgiving, and I would see her,
Mm-hmm.
and I would occasionally see my father. But day to day, and then during those moments, I absolutely, it's kind of when we talk about that, like, you feel like you're just somewhere in the middle. and here's your first family and here's your adopted family and where the heck do I fit in?
Yeah.
That's been the majority of my thought process.
And what's interesting about your statement is that you are amongst family and
Mm-hmm.
still had the question, where do I fit in?
Mm-hmm. 100%. Yep.
That is, wow. Even
Mm-hmm.
amongst family, and because you have been shaken up and moved here, moved there, you've been disconnected. Now I'm
Yeah.
trying to figure out, where does my piece of the puzzle fit in? And
It's very hard to find that.
yeah,
It's very, and it doesn't, some people might argue, whoever watches this, if they disagree, I don't care. But someone might
it's your
argue,
story.
yeah, someone might argue that, yes, kinship care is so appropriate, but it comes with its own complexities,
Right.
and I would argue, although I feel fortunate enough to know my first family, it just brings a whole nother layer to it of that whole piece of where in the heck do I fit in and where do I stand where am I standing?
Because it's got to be weird too. I don't know. You tell me, because I've never experienced this, but going to the family functions. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
look, there's my mom.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah. Knowing what I know now, when I tried to, as a child experiencing that,
mm,
I didn't quite know the feeling and the emotion until now as an adult. But I remember going to events and seeing my biological mother, seeing my father, seeing my sister, sitting on the stools in my grandmother's kitchen, watching her bake the cookies for, you know, Christmas or whatever, while smoking her cigarette and putting it out in the ashtray. I remember these things, and I remember this feeling of like, the only way I can describe it is like guilt, like
hmm,
a feeling of guilt
why? Explain
of
that.
here I am seeing these people that birthed me
Uh
and
huh.
raised me for 11 years. And it's something that I now know through treatment. That's not my fault. It's not my fault. I get that. But identifying it and really what it was at the time was this feeling of guilt, of like misplaced guilt, like taking on this feeling of guilt of, I'm in a better place. And yeah.
And you might have also been feeling that because I was just thinking about your sister. She's watching you go through all this,
Mm-hmm.
but she's not going through any of this.
Mm-hmm.
You might have been taking on guilt because of feeling, like some type of way, or she might have been feeling some type of way. Do you know?
Yeah, we we talk almost daily now.
Okay.
She has her own sets of feelings. You kind of hit the nail on the head. Like she, is not going to tell me, I feel angry because you got out of it and I didn't. She's not a
Mm,
very emotionally available person. She spent a lot of time having to sort of stay in survival mode, and she's doing great now. Um, but we talk nowadays, and I finally have gotten her to a point of like, can you please have a conversation with me? you
listen,
know?
it's probably very hard for her because, like you just said,
hmm
when you grow up in survival mode, nothing else is important.
Mm,
I just got to get from day to day. I got to make sure I got something to eat. I got to make sure I have some money in my pocket. I got to make sure I have some place to sleep. Anything else is not important. And even, as you're growing up, learning how to communicate, that's not important. Is that going to
yeah,
get me where I need to, they're just getting from point A to point B to point C. Because I know people like that as adults that have spent their life in survival mode.
yeah. It's
and there's just
exhausting.
oh, so exhausting. So exhausting. So the fact that you've got your sister to a point that you can have even a small conversation, that's progress. I
Mm-hmm.
applaud you.
Yeah.
That's progress. The fact that you all talk almost every day, that's
Mm-hmm.
progress.
Yeah, I would agree with
Yeah.
that. I she probably feels in a certain sense that she would have appreciated being in a safer space.
I'm
Um,
sure.
but she also was the one, excuse me, that told me, do you hear
The
my
dog
dog?
is fine. She's fine.
She was also the one that had told me, after I was adopted and I went off to my undergraduate degree, I went to Florida State, and I was 17 going on 18. Yeah, yep. Both my degrees are from there. Um, and she was the one that told me that, and what's the truth, right? My adopted parents, till the day they die, will probably say one thing. My biological family will, or, my biological parents will probably say another. But I remember her saying, Dad, my biological father,
Mhm.
Dad has been trying to talk to you for a long time.
Mm.
And I said, What? And
And
she said, Yeah, you didn't know that? Like, Dad tries to call, Dad tried to send letters.
huh.
Um, but when I talked to my adoptive parents, it's like, no, when he knew, and I'm gonna say this in a way that, like, I love my adopted mom, and she's just only telling me her side of the story, but
Right.
she says the moment he knew that he did not have to financially care for you,
Mm. He
that
tapped out.
he was like, okay, I'm fine. I'm fine signing these papers. The way I see it is a little bit of both. Um, I see it as he loved me and he cared for me. He also was one of 12, 11, 12 kids, had to drop out of school at a really young age,
Survival mode.
survival mode, and he knew how to read, he knew how to write, but I just think that, like, he didn't quite understand what it was that he was signing.
Mm.
And I'm not sure they did a very good job at explaining that to
Explaining.
him.
Now, have you had? Oh, well, have you talked to him?
So I never approached that conversation with my biological father. He passed away in
Mm.
2017.
Okay.
Um, so I never really had that conversation. I just kind of, like, over the years would keep in communication with him and just have that
Okay.
surface level, like, how are you doing?
Gotcha. Gotcha.
Um, but I was with him. I feel comforted knowing that I was with him the day he passed. I was holding his hand, and I remember him kind of holding on, um, and I feel peace, knowing that I remember saying, it's okay, we're
It's
going to be
okay.
okay.
It's
We're all
okay.
going to be okay. Because I have a biological sister, full-blooded, and then I have three half-brothers from
Right.
my dad's
So
previous marriage.
I want to ask you, after hearing this story and what this has been like for you, how are you, the adult Tara? How are you doing? How are you
Mm,
navigating today?
that's so funny. You use the word navigating, and I wanted to talk to you about a workbook I'm coming out with.
Okay.
Um, so don't let me forget, but because part of the title is navigating adoption.
Oh,
So you use
looks
the
like
word
that was
navigate,
confirmation for you.
right? I think I feel that I'm navigating it well. I'm a therapist also. Like, I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I'm a
Hmm.
therapist. That doesn't mean we don't have our problems. Even the therapist needs therapy. But I think if I didn't have that viewpoint of things, it would make it a little harder. But I
Mm.
think I'm doing okay. I think there's still a sense of emptiness and sort of like I still feel like, where am I? I'm right here.
Really?
Absolutely.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Now,
Yeah.
did your experience in life, is that what prompted you to become a therapist?
I think so. I partially, so I'm adopted, obviously, but I'm also a birth mother. My daughter will be 18 in
I was
August.
turning the corner. I was coming. I was coming
Hmm.
around the mountain.
Yep. Um, so, I've seen kind of both perspectives. I don't know if that helps at all, but
So, okay, so then I'll pull it back because when we were talking, I was like, I was getting there. I did not forget about that.
yeah.
So, how do you come to that decision that to have to become a birth mom?
Oof. Um, well, yeah. I mean, look, I listen to a lot of other adoptees, and I feel that I like to hear other people's perspectives. Um, and I know that there's some out there that are pretty angry, right, about being adopted. And so um, I always tread this conversation lightly, but I'm learning as I'm on my journey to just like it is what it is, and this is my story. But um, I think that everything kind of happened at once when I learned of my father, my biological father, reaching back out, or what my sister had told me about my dad,
Mm-hmm.
trying to keep in communication. So when I became pregnant, I was 18. I had Lizzie at 19, and it was right around that time of like, wait, my biological father was trying to communicate with me, and just this like confusion and yet again, where do I fit in? Um,
Mm-hmm.
I found myself, in not such good situations
Mm-hmm.
while in college and became pregnant, and I was scared.
Yeah,
I was
for
freaking
sure.
scared. Yeah. Um,
And so, did you decide? Was it an open or closed adoption? What did you?
so I have an open adoption.
Okay.
I haven't actually had like physical contact,
Okay.
in-person contact with my daughter since she was five, five or
Okay.
six. But I communicate like every couple to a few months with her mother, her adopted mother. Um, we have each other's cell phone numbers. We're on each other's Facebooks,
Now, let me ask you this: as a birth mother, do you feel like that's confusing for your daughter, or has that been confusing to ask? Because you talked about feeling confused amongst family and in
Mhm.
that situation. So to have been adopted, and then she has her adoptive family, but then I've got my biological mom that communicates here and there.
Mhm.
Is that confusing for the child?
So yes and no. Yes, I think it's confusing for her. I think it's that idea of like, where do I fit in? But I hope, at least from what I'm seeing, that by her knowing that we're communicating openly,
Mm,
that might help with it not being as confusing, right? She's
mm-hmm.
always going to have that space of something's missing. But I think that adoption should be the last resort.
Mm-hmm.
I think there should be so many services that are in place to help families stay together. Even knowing that I knew what adoption was before I made my decision, I probably could have had a lot more support from the adults and professionals around me
Mm.
to teach me, hey, this is how you can make it work. And although it's
So
scary,
for a lack of resources,
absolutely.
and you're like, I don't have another choice. This is the choice that I'm going to have to make
Yeah.
at this time. And you're a young 19-year-old mind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. And I hear that a lot, between a lack of resources, a lack of money.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I personally just, I am not an adoptee that's angry. Let's just start there. That's not my story. But I understand what it's like to, I don't even know if I want to call it confused, but just, just wanting to know. And I think the beauty in having the open adoption, although I wouldn't know what that would feel like. My adoption was completely closed. So I don't
Mm-hmm.
have an experience in that. But just wanting to know, because I always wanted to know, where did I come from? Your daughter knows that piece. So I think that piece is what um, would help the adoptee when it comes to an
Mm.
open adoption,
To know.
to know.
Oh,
Just
yes.
know she
Yeah.
knows what you look like. She knows where she comes from. Just knowing, and maybe, and I don't know. It depends on the individual person whether or not they feel confused or lost because of the biological parent was coming, in and out. My question would be, as a kid anyway, would they think, what? Well, if I see them from time to time, how come I can't go with them?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't
It's
know.
so complex.
I know. I know. There's
It's
so
so
many questions.
complex.
And
And
I don't have, there's no definitive answer, but those are the questions that I think about. And just
yeah.
out of sheer curiosity, what is that like for that adoptee?
Mm-hmm. Confusion at times. Yeah. It I firmly feel that when you talk to a person who is adopted and they're a minor, as early on as you can talk about it, studies show
Mm-hmm.
that if you talk about it in an age appropriate way throughout their entire life, and you talk about the elephant in the room in an age appropriate way, it's going to be better for them. It won't take away the shame, the guilt, the confusion with identity, all of that. It won't take any of that away, but it'll help a little bit.
I can speak to that for sure because I was told at a very young age. But I've never been ashamed of being adopted. I was actually very proud to be adopted. Um, if anything, because my parents are old school, and they were just like, okay, you don't have to tell everybody.
Oh,
Because they come from an era of, you just don't talk about
yeah.
that. Um, I was telling everybody, okay,
Mm-hmm.
because, but it did not take away just the wanting to know, the longing to know,
Yeah.
because I didn't grow up seeing anyone that looked like me. And I never felt out of place. Just, I know I don't look like anybody. I know I do things a little different, but as far as moving differently, that didn't come until like high school when I started knowing a little more about DNA and that, oh, okay, yeah, I do things a little bit differently.
Right.
Yeah, I get, and I
Yeah.
understand why I probably, uh, do. So I think it's probably an individual, but I am like an advocate, like you said, tell them early and speak about it in an age appropriate manner.
Yeah.
It will save you some problems in the end, for sure.
Absolutely.
For sure.
I like have this desire to talk about this right now, so if I can, but um, can I touch a little bit just on like, I really feel that, like I said, there needs to be services in place for people to stay together and that this is a systemic issue.
Mm,
And I
talk about it.
just, yeah,
Go ahead.
because I am adopted and I am, a mother who made a decision to relinquish my rights. But I've also done this adoption work. I work in the field of adoptions for the last, since 2010, and I feel angry right now,
Mm,
because I just feel like there's so much that can be done to preserve the family and to not have to get to the point of adoption,
okay.
right? I still think adoption is something that I wouldn't be doing what I do if I didn't agree with it, but I think it can be something that works for a child and is necessary at times. But I think a lot of times things could be done on the front end
Mm-hmm.
to help keep families together, and there's not enough of that happening,
Mm,
especially with legislation that's going on right now and sort of taking away from, there's just a lot of people, agencies, attorneys who maybe should get on the bandwagon of how do we help people stay together, although we might help with adoption? How do we not feel afraid due to whatever financial reasons are there? Because let's talk
mm-hmm.
about that, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do we get to a point of ethics and morals to make it better? And I know that might take more time on a different conversation, but I have to say that I think that there should be a governing body, federal level, that oversees all that happens because it is so broken
It's
and people do things in such different ways and it shouldn't be how it is today. So I'll say that.
no, and I love that you said that. And I want you to touch on, unless you wanted to talk to me about it offline, I want to give you an opportunity to speak about the workbook that you're working on.
Yeah, yeah.
Please talk about it.
I'm not done with it yet. My good friend and colleague Veronica with Rooted in Adoption
Mm-hmm.
encouraged me to do this, and she gave me a deadline, told me February. She held me to
Oh,
it.
clock's
Um,
ticking.
so I'm almost there, but it's going to be titled Navigating Adoption um, in Reunion, Disenfranchised Grief, and Learning to Heal Through It All. So, it's kind of this, it's a workbook for adoptive parents. I'm kind of tweaking with if I want to just do it in the sense of it, teaching adoptive parents or for adult adoptees specifically, but it's designed to sort of like walk you through the life as an adult who's been adopted because there's a lot of workbooks for children and not enough for adults. And it touches on things like when your birth parents pass or if they're aging and dying, what does that feel like? Um, just this searching, being
Hmm.
in reunion, all sorts of different facets of it. Yeah.
That's that sounds amazing because what you just said, I've never, yeah, when they're aging or they're sick or they're passed or
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and I totally agree with you that there's not enough resources out there for the adult adoptee.
Yeah.
And then I can break it down even more as a black person, the black adoptee. There's even less out there, which is why I do what I
Yes. Thank you.
do. Which
Yeah.
is yeah, so I want to thank you so much for coming and sharing your story, talking about your workbook. Please keep me posted. I
Mm-hmm.
will shout it out when you're done with it. I appreciate your story. It's so you have a different story.
Mm.
But I always say that we all have the same story, but it's different.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for having me. I think if there's anything that I want to like say outside of what I just did, it's
Yes, please do.
educate these adoptive families,
Mm,
elevate others who don't necessarily have as many followers or space to sort of get word out about education and teaching people about the different nuances and the trauma behind it. But I do have a monthly. Veronica and I have what's called Adoptee Brew, and every other month is virtual. Then we hold some in person. We have one coming up on February 18th.
yes.
I don't know if she
virtual,
told you.
right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I should
And
be
it's
able to
just
write that one.
Yes, please, please.
Should
It's
be
just
able
an
to write that
open
one.
conversation for people
Yeah.
to not feel
And-
scared to ask questions.
And I will drop all of your links in the description of this
Thank you.
podcast. And
Thank
thank you again so much for joining me and coming on here and telling your story. Every single story is important. And every time we open our mouths, we are definitely helping someone for sure.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And on that note, bye, family.
Journey, journey on, journey, journey on. You need a pie, what they good? Oh yeah, what the one? Adoption.